Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Martin Hamilton. I'm Director of Leeds Civic Trust. This is the third in a series of conversations that we're having, really looking at how Leeds comes out of the post-COVID-19 situation and hopefully comes out of it in a better place. And actually, this particular session is very much about building back better, about how we end up in a better place in the months and years to come than we were in three months ago, if you like. So that's really very much the focus of this session. Up until now, we've been doing one-to-one interviews. This one is slightly a panel discussion today. So we've got an hour to go at this, which isn't a lot of time. So I'm not going to say any more, other than just to say to people, could we just very, very briefly introduce ourselves? I'm looking at my screen and going clockwise. So Paul, do you want to just say who you are?
Hi, my name is Paul Chatterton. My day job is I'm Professor of Urban Futures at the University of Leeds in the School of Geography, but I'm also involved in the Lilac Co-housing project and Our Future Leeds and other civic groups in the city. So thanks.
Sai.
Greetings. Yeah, my name's Sai Murray. I am a writer, poet. I'm also, excuse me, a member of the Racial Justice Network based in Leeds, West Yorkshire.
Shannon.
Hi, I'm Shannon Jackson. My day job is working for Social Schools Community Benefit Society, but I'm here today with non-working role with Youth Strike and with Robbie.
Robbie.
Yeah, Robbie Strathy. Yeah, Leeds Youth Strike for Climate.
Ruth. You're on mute.
My screen is stuck. Okay,
All right. Okay.
Got it now. I'm in the lucky position of not having a day job because I'm retired. I used to be a public health doctor, and I currently chair the Leeds Clean Air Alliance, which is an alliance of about 25 organisations looking to bring about increases in public in walking and cycling, reducing air pollution related to transport, and reducing greenhouse gases related to transport. And I spend a lot of my time on that at the moment. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Ruth. Okay, so what we're going to start off with is I'm going to ask the panelists to answer a sort of a question or a point that I hope will open up discussion. And I'm going to start off with Paul, because Paul, you've just put in the chat function there a link to a blog that you've written. I should say, if anyone wants to comment during the course of this hour, please do so. Any questions that you want to raise, we'll try and pull those together and ask them of the panel members. But yeah, Paul, you've provided this link to a blog post that you've written, which really looks at, as the title suggests, how Leeds can be more sustainable after COVID-19. And there's a plan at the end of that, isn't there? Do you want to say a little bit about that and kind of what your vision is for the city in the future?
Yep, great. 2 minutes on this, yeah. And so that's my pitch for being West Yorkshire Mayor, right, for next year.
Exactly. I'm asking everyone the question, are you going to go for West Yorkshire Mayor? So right. There we go.
I imagine that. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to write that blog piece as well, because I tried to fundamentally try to frame it in the lockdown period of what exactly is a city like Leeds for? I think the lockdown gave us an opportunity to think about, what are our places actually for? Because coming out of this kind of really high-paced, kind of globalized pro-growth period of the last few decades, I think we've got to a junction point now. It's what kind of city do we want and do we need in the future? Because not only has this kind of globalized, fast-paced model of urban growth of cities that have created a city like Leeds led to a lot of inequalities and the trickle down isn't working and all that kind of stuff, and the high dependency on fossil fuels. Apart from all that bad stuff, which we can reflect on in this debate, is actually now looking quite risky, because it's not a safe model for the future. A post-COVID recovery city needs to be much more localized, much more equal, and much more responsive to some of the social and ecological issues, we're seeing rattling through the world rapidly right now. So I just put this 10-point plan, which you can see at the bottom of that blog, but I kind of grouped it together in 3 big issues. One was breaking car dependency, really seriously sorting this out as a city. We've got a really ambitious council who's totally up for this. But how do we break car culture? And that's a really complex thing. A lot of it's in our minds, psychologically, as well as in the infrastructure around us. And a lot of it is really relocalizing life, right? And thinking, what is this 15-minute neighborhood, this local life, which is going to unlock our well-being and our safety in the future. So that's the first thing, breaking car dependency. Second one is this kind of what I call the kind of socially useful city. What is a socially useful economy in Leeds? We've seen loads of corporate growth, which is good. Okay, it brings in wealth, brings in tax, all that kind of stuff. But how do we balance that with a socially useful economy? And I think stuff like citizens' income, a Leeds basic income, reusing space, office space, which is going to be underused now in the city centre, have come of age. We need to have these debates of the city. Corporate wealth is now has got too much of a free hand in Leeds. That is not a popular view, but we need to bring it back into the reins on the social agenda, right, for the benefit of the city. One of the big things we could talk about is the idea of a Leeds Lucas plan, where you take the factories and the businesses of the city and you put them to social use. So wind turbines, e-bikes, whatever you want, rather than SUVs, Land Rovers and whatever else, yeah? And certainly the big task of home insulation, street by street, because these are the big blobs of carbon we need to reduce to tackle the climate emergency. Emissions from transport and emissions from leaky homes. And the third one then is what I call kind of mass greening, because what we've realised during lockdown is how poor, bad and disconnected our green spaces are. In any future epidemic, and especially maybe a COVID second wave, we've seen the importance of green spaces, right? And how they underpin our well-being. We need to have many, many more green spaces rather than the constant development of private developments and highways, yeah? My final point is, how does all this happen? Well, we're going to discuss this. I've got many ideas. We simply need a new kind of politics, more participatory, more democratic, more oversight over budgeting. And the words of Greta Thunberg always live with me, and that's what the youth strikes really inspired me. We are all doing our best. No problem, right? I've not got a particular grudge against anybody in this city. I'm doing my best. But you know what? Our best isn't good enough. We have to do the impossible to deal with this triple crisis, the climate, the social and the public health crisis. So that's my introductory points.
Paul, how much of this is something within our grasp as a city? I mean, how much of this can we sort of say tomorrow, we can, not only can we do this, but we have the powers to do it? And how much of it is actually dependent upon others, governments, international bodies actually moving in this direction?
Yep, sure. There's lots of things out of our control. I mean, one of the big things we have in Britain is that lots of problems made in Westminster can only be solved in Westminster. So we don't just need symbolic devolution, we need proper, substantial devolution with resources. But you know what? The central state can devolve lots of resources to the region, but what we need, and I think what we've possibly starting to get, are leaders who get this paradigm shift, right? So whoever the next mayor's going to be, or whoever the leaders of the councils continue to be in West Yorkshire Combined Authority, they need to get behind this paradigm shift. So low carbon growth and inclusive growth ain't going to cut the mustard. We need a West Yorkshire Green New Deal, a proper paradigm shift based on a complete rejigging of power. That's unlocking the potential of community development in this, yeah? So some things Westminster certainly, some things Leeds can't do. So we need a proper government with teeth over regulation, social and environmental regulation, new powers to control this stuff nationally, which then local authorities can get stuck into. Because I imagine there might be planners on this call who are like thinking, I'm tearing my hair out. I can't stop the developers doing this stuff because they'll just appeal and it'll go to national appeal. So we need proper powers with teeth locally.
Thanks, Paul. We'll come back to some of these points a little bit later. I'm sure we will. Sai, could I turn to you then, and a slightly different issue for you to sort of talk about. I mean, several things it seems to me have changed over the last 3 months in terms of people's lifestyles, and part of the trick is going to be how do we capitalise on that in the future. And in a sense, what Paul's talking about there, there's a way in to do that now. People have got used to not using their car and walking and all that sort of thing. But I wanted to talk about the recent events in the US, the protests in the UK, the events in Birmingham, the statue being toppled, etc. Which you know, I mean, how much of this is wrapped up in the COVID-19 crisis? How much of this is part of a wider picture about people wanting change? But this is obviously a specific area to do with racial equality. So I guess, you know, part of Paul's analysis and agenda is talking about a more equal and a socially equitable society. And I guess the protests and debates that are happening now around racial equality are part of that. How do you think we can actually make those changes in Leeds? What changes do you think we should be making in that area?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that some really good points have been made already by Paul and yourself in terms of how this is maybe framed as separate, but it is connected, as you say, that we can definitely connect these issues. And I think it's important, obviously, we're going to hear from Shannon and Robbie on climate specifically, but I think it's important to connect everything, to connect how we rebuild, to connect the COVID, and to connect race and all kind of social disease and problems we have together. So we can't separate them, and any plan moving forward has to take into account the ongoing struggle from marginalized and minoritized communities. So I think what we're seeing now is a moment. It's definitely something that you know, is sweeping the world, and it's being, a lot of things are being highlighted, but I think it's also important not to just focus on the one incident that has sparked this, and to realize that there is a systemic problems at hand here. And it's been heartening to see as well that in the UK, watching and being aware of the protests, that many commentators have also linked what's happening in the US to what's happened historically and currently in Britain. So we can't escape the racism we have here. We can't escape the racism and the policing that we have in the UK and in Leeds. And obviously we know about examples that we have in this city, the most famous of which, David Olawale, but also, you know, present day policing. The Racial Justice Network have worked regularly with migrant communities and have a couple of ongoing campaigns, Stop the Scan and Yorkshire Resists, which particularly looks at the use of biometric details that the police are now rolling out and use to capture and data, and with links to the Home Office. So there's a lot of disproportionate policing of Black and brown communities within Leeds, and obviously that's a global issue. So in terms of building back better, I think, you know, there's lots the city can look at, and I think part of this is really, you know, that there's a lot of talk of obviously the power of the corporations and the power of the governance that we have, but as we've seen the protests are demonstrating, there's a real urgency from the people themselves, and so there's a listening moment that needs to be done as well. So and that is happening. We're seeing a lot of corporations, a lot of people jumping on the hashtags and kind of trying to brand themselves as socially aware and everything else, but it can't stop there. It needs to be joined up with the real tough work of addressing our legacy of racism, the colonial history we have, which is all a symptom of the climate crisis as well. That the climate crisis is a racist crisis, and you know, for 400 odd years we've had the destruction of lands across the planet. The British Empire, that Britain was built, Leeds was built by the toil and sweat of people, not just in Europe but also overseas. And so, you know, in terms of how we repair the damage, we need to factor in the global picture, not just Leeds, and how anything we do has to really factor in how it affects the rest of the world, you know, what resources we still take from the rest of the world, the new carbon technologies, the carbon captures, the green technologies, they will also be sourced, and the technology we're using now is sourced from across the world. So it's about linking up these issues and really moving forward with a global picture in mind, and educating ourselves on our part in this.
Howard Metcalf's made an interesting point here. He says, you know, what does the panel think, how is this moment different from previous moments, and why will the opportunity to change not be missed this time? I think that's really important, isn't it? What is it about now that gives us hope that things can and will change? Does anyone want to say anything about that? Sai or anyone else?
Martin Ruth, can I just come in for a minute?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking now specifically about the changes that have happened over since lockdown. And I think, I mean, I'm older than most of you on this panel, and probably a lot of the audience. And in my lifetime, professional lifetime, I have never seen such an opportunity to do something about getting increasing levels of walking and cycling. And the key reason is because people want to do it. They have seen the benefits of low levels of traffic in their neighborhood. They have seen the benefits that they can get from walking and cycling. And that's the real change that's happened in relation to physical activity. People want to do it.
Yeah, I think that's, if people live something, then there's more likely to be a change rather than people observing it from the sidelines. I think that is a key thing, isn't it? And some useful feedback there from, I mean, Paul, you're saying ideas are more developed now, for example, than sort of 10 years ago, 12 years ago with the financial crisis. Yeah, I think maybe things are we are in a slightly different place than we were previously. Could I come on to Shannon and Robbie? And it's almost a sort of a follow-on from that question, really, which is, you know, we had the protests across the country last year. We had the youth strike and climate action moving right up the, up the political agenda, not necessarily to the top of the political agenda, but certainly in the nation's conscience, it went right up to the top of people's lists. But I guess there's now an issue with where COVID-19, does that actually help us? Is it a help in keeping this issue alive and actually building on it? Or actually, is there a danger that people will say, hang on a minute, you know, we've been closed down now for 3 months, the economy's in tatters, we're going to have a recession, the priority has got to be to get the economy going, we'll worry about climate at some other stage. So in capturing the moment of COVID-19 and what happens afterwards, is there a danger that on climate, we may actually lose some momentum? Robbie?
I mean, I think there's always that danger, but going back to the previous point about why this moment is different, I think because the movement has been going on, it's been on the headlines every now and again over the past year, and as you said, it's in like the nation's consciousness. So I think that provides a good foundation to move forward and really launch and use that to launch like Build Back Better and all that sort of stuff. But I think there's some like real parallels between COVID and climate. So it's like this big societal issue that really like threatens our health and well-being, especially for like most marginalized communities. Like I'm sure everyone's seen like the really shocking statistics about how COVID has impacted like BAME communities the most. And that's the same with climate change. So it's this huge societal issue, and it's going to affect the health of everybody, but especially, and it's already been affecting for years, the health of the most marginalized communities. So I think because there's those parallels, that kind of resonates with people, because when you can talk about health, and it kind of helps people understand the issue that all this COVID's been going on. So my brother is doing some articles for XR Sheffield, and he's talking about Build Back Better there. And somebody commented underneath one of those articles, like, you know, they're probably right. Look how a virus has brought society to its knees, and think what climate change is going to do. So I think that shows that if we come at it from the angle of how it's a threat to people's health, and especially like health inequality, that can really resonate with people and help them understand. I don't want to go on too long, but just a final point about this thing about getting the economy moving again. But that's a silly argument, because there's been like loads of studies to show that this is the future for the economy, is green technology and tackling the climate crisis. There was a report from a bunch of economists at Oxford just about a month ago. So it was like Joseph Stiglitz and Nicholas Stern. So they're like really like famous, like respected economists, and they were saying that tackling climate change has the answer to our economic problems. So that it just kind of shows that it's a silly argument to say that we shouldn't prioritize climate change because to save the economy, because they're the same thing basically. And so we need to keep making the arguments in that sort of like political capacity and like in academic capacity, but then it's up to, I guess, like the different movements that there is to really like make the noise so those arguments are listened to and our leaders see sense.
Shannon, could I ask you a question, sort of following on from that, which is sort of looking on the positive side, I suppose. You know, the fact is that our lives have changed in the last few months. They've been forced to change. It has been a shock, you know, complete shock to the system. Something that, you know, probably I suspect people haven't experienced anything like it since, you know, rationing in the Second World War, at least in this country. So it's a big change, and so I guess those changes, I think that part of what we're saying is that those changes will survive a post-COVID world. So people's working patterns will change. The way people travel will change. The way people live will change, and some of those changes will stay for a long time. So and a lot of those changes are in the very nature supportive of the climate change agenda, it seems to me. So that's a positive. But we can see the changes that we've had very, very quickly over the last 3 months. You know, we can see that there were fewer cars on the road. So the change and the positive change was immediate. Whereas with climate emergency, it's still something that for people, they don't see, you know, in their immediate lives, do they? It's something in the future that will happen, but they can't quite grasp it. So I think, you know, I don't know if you want to comment on that sort of area.
Yeah, of course. I think you're right in the sense that COVID and the lifestyle changes that we've all experienced, I guess, have created a greater resonance of a lot of the messages of the climate movement here in the West around, you know, the need to prioritise health first and to not have that as a second agenda, to think long term, and to kind of look at how we're structuring things like the economy. But I would also say that we need to be careful and have a bit of a global perspective in how we frame the climate issue and what Sai was saying around taking that international perspective. You know, it's not a coming crisis, it's existing. There are people who are being killed because of disasters now, and I think we need to bring that back into the conversation. But yeah, I think in our communities there's probably greater resonance of you know, the types of changes that we've been talking about within Youth Strike, and also I guess a hope that we can have large scale behaviour change in society when it's needed, and that human beings are doing that for the sake of human health, and that we can act en masse to protect others and kind of you know, sacrifice things like personal freedom to help our families and everyone in our community. I think you know, messages like that were a key to the environmental movement, but I also think, yeah, we need to see the interlinking of the climate and that struggle with the changes to the economy, with racial justice. It's all all into one.
Could I ask, maybe a couple of you want to chip in on this one? Thanks for that, Shannon. About something that someone has raised on here, which is a very topical example of kind of this debate around the future economy and climate change, which is Leeds and Bradford Airport. So there are planning applications in at the moment to effectively put some new buildings in place, improve the departure lounges, etc. And that's because the airport has plans to expand its passenger numbers over the next few years. Plans which actually are part of a government strategy, but obviously the buildings will help them achieve that. The argument is, we need an airport, we need a functioning airport with more people using it for the economy to grow. What do people feel about the proposed airport expansion? I'm looking at Paul, I'm looking at all of you, but I know Paul's made a couple of comments here.
I'll just make some introductory comments, shall I? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, given that time's pressing, we need to, talk truth to power here. I mean, like, Leeds Bradford Airport's part of the fantasy politics of this city, that it has no real future in a sustainable economy. Of course, it does generate some growth, but that growth goes to the 1%, not the 99%, so we know that like 70% of flights are, accounted for by 50% of the population. So, it's not something which is an inclusive bit of infrastructure for the city. And, by 2030, if all the other kind of areas of carbon decline in the city, that's going to account for 50% of the whole of the city's carbon emissions. So there's no scientific basis for the airport. It's a dangerous thing, especially for young people, for the next generation. It drives inequality. It's not for the whole city. And these arguments that it's an employment zone are entirely spurious. I'd love to explore this with the chief exec. The amount of investment going into the airport on the basis that it's some employment zone is entirely fictitious. The real hot money for employment needs to go into Green New Deal, retrofitting housing, active travel and community employment. We've got this really good inclusive growth strategy of the city, getting employment into inner city neighbourhoods, creating community cooperatives, employing people in low income neighbourhoods, right, which can be a real virtual cycle of growth.
Anyone else want to comment on the airport question?
Paul,
Ruth.
Martin, it's Ruth.
Yeah.
Put my hand up on. I mean, I think that I absolutely agree with everything Paul has said. And the other thing is that the application talks about sustainable aircraft fuel and puts forward a whole lots of suggestions which actually are pie in the sky based on reality and completely outdated and completely disproven. So there really is, it's important to unpick all elements of this application and oppose it on every front, I think.
I think a point that maybe wasn't there before. I mean, some of these arguments could have been made before. There's absolutely no doubt. I think an argument that you could that certainly didn't apply 3 months ago, that most definitely applies now, or has certainly been highlighted, is the fact that the airline industry is on its knees. I mean, airline companies are on their knees. That we've seen how heavily they're being subsidised through government funds to keep them afloat, and so whatever happens, you're going to see an airline industry, if it continues, I suspect that has to be directly subsidised by government. The load factors they need to make money, which aren't going to be allowed for some time with social distancing. So there's the additional issue of actually the whole economy around the airline industry going kaput. So I think that's an extra dimension that may actually mean that proposals to expand airports are no longer relevant because there won't be the aircraft to actually land there. So I think that's another angle. Robbie.
Yeah, I just think there's like this phrase flying around. It's measure what matters. So that's really about the idea that it's not growth that we should be chasing. It's people's health and well-being, because that's the priority, right? Isn't it? And then once we start looking at health and well-being, we realise that development like the airport it's not going to help that at all. It might help growth, but the climate impact and the pollution and the noise, that's going to negatively impact everyone's health and well-being. So I think we really need to kind of abandon this ridiculous obsession with growth, and even like inclusive growth. The fact that the council's got this inclusive growth kind of agenda is like, it shows that they get it. Like inclusive growth, like they want it to benefit people, so the inclusive part, but just forget about growth altogether, because that's not the important part. It's people's health and people's well-being, and when you start measuring things against that, and that's where you really start getting somewhere, and the developments in the economy actually bring benefit to people. And it's been done like in some different places, like New Zealand. They had a well-being budget about a year ago, and there's a really good quote from the finance minister, and they said, success is making New Zealand both a great place to make a living and a great place to make a life. I felt that was really good. So like, we need to make Leeds a great place to make a living and a great place to make a life. And that's how we measure success. So yeah, we really need to hone in and make that the priority, is health and well-being. And that's, once we do that, we kind of unlock the political will and ability to prioritize like action on climate change, action on racial justice, and restructuring the economy so it works for people.
Thanks, Robbie. Shannon, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say, and I don't know if Robbie will agree with me here, but one of the kind of key things that I've been thinking throughout the whole airport campaign is, I guess, anger towards the council position in particular, in the sense that, and I think from the kind of youth strike movement, you know, we've had strong council support and councillors turning up to our strikes, and then you have something like the airport, which is, you know, a test. It's a test of, okay, what are the priorities within our council, and they're you know, they're saying that they have no power, but they do. Bristol took a stance. The council took a stance against their airport, and there are, you know, the national planning framework, that routes that they could follow legally to take a more active stance against the airport, rather than just saying it's up to national regulation. I think the local authority isn't doing enough in terms of putting people's health first, and it's just trying to shift the responsibility onto national government, and there are things that they could do. And I think just on behalf of youth strike, and Robbie can disagree with this if it's not true, but personally I felt incredibly let down by, there's been words but not followed through in when it comes to action and the real test, which is the airport.
I mean, just to finish up on this, I guess just to sort of, you know, give the sort of legal and political perspective on this. I mean, there are two issues. There's the general support that the council may give to the airport and its expansion, which is a sort of a policy issue. And then there's a planning application, which is going through a legal planning process, and the council won't you know, will make a decision on that at the end of the process. The plans committee will make that decision, and it may be to approve or to refuse or whatever. So, you know, there's on the one hand the council with a generally supportive view about the airport expanding, and then there are specific planning applications, and that process is, you know, is dealt with by the plans panel, and the council won't comment on that in advance of a decision being made. But it'll be interesting to see how that turns out, because, as you say, Bristol and other places have actually, you know, voted against proposals to expand their airports. I want to move on to Ruth before we finish with some general questions. But before we do, I just wanted to pick up on something that in the chat, going back to Sai. David Barnes asked, what support / solidarity can the climate movement give to the BLM movement? Have you got any thoughts on that, Si?
Yeah, so in the chat I shared a blog which the Racial Justice Network wrote, speaking to this, and there's some suggested actions there. Obviously, I think I'll read the 5 suggested things out. So one of them is to, if you're on social media, to really follow, join, and interact with anti-racist organisations. And there's a qualifier in that check out that they are by people with lived experience, because as we've seen, there's a lot of people who are now trying to jump on the hashtag and jump on this moment. And
sure,
and
Yorkshire tea even, I think.
Yeah, I've got that Yorkshire tea. But yeah, I think there's also you know, it's a symptom of the way we live now, isn't it? People are sharing things on social media just for kudos. So we need to look deeper than just the you know, showy activism. And you can number two is, you know, if you are from a migrant background, you know, it's okay to step back. And I think one initiative that the Racial Justice Network has, which is, you know, a really good model of this, is the Unlearning Racism Collective. I'll share the link in the chat as well. And this is, there's a blog here which speaks to that. And this is a course which is led by people identifying as white, to really educate themselves around the racism that we all learn through our education system. So I think education is key to this. Number three, holding systems to account. So it's really understanding that racism is one person, and yeah, not expending energy, and solidarity. There's also a list on that blog of practical things you can do to get involved with the various campaigns, and links to support the work. And there are obviously lots of initiatives within Leeds. At this moment, when we're talking about building back, there's so many initiatives that I'm aware of, and there's many more that people have been involved in, which have always struggled for resources, and it is quite heartening that some of these are now getting attention, but this needs to go beyond just this moment. I think we need to kind of, it's an everyday experience for migrant communities, for Black and brown people, and people who are marginalised. So I think that this support needs to continue. And one of the parallels that was raised yesterday by our director, Penina Wangari Jones, was the young Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi, who was discovered washed up on the beach in Turkey. And there's so much outpouring of emotion and a will to change the situation of border control and the migrant crisis. But kind of that did die down after the news cycle moved on. So I think it's really important that we do take the time to recognise where we are, to recognise this is structural, this is historical, and to do some deep thinking and learning around change and how we move forward.
Thanks, Si. Okay, Ruth, I wanted to just finish sort of with you, and then I've got a couple of sort of general points that I want us to wrap up with. But Ruth, I guess, you know, in terms of the work that you do around air quality, you know, we've seen self-evidently an improvement in air quality in the last 3 months. Things are creeping back up again, but we have seen some improvements. But I guess, you know, how do we actually ensure that those things, we've kind of touched on this, but how do we ensure that air quality remains good in the long term? How do we build on this short term and make it long term? And you know, your particular interest in air quality, of course.
Well, I mean, the particular interest in air quality really was one of the ways that I saw of getting a wider buy-in into the active travel agenda. So we have air quality, we have climate related, transport related climate greenhouse gases, and we have active travel. And that whole package of things gives you a way of looking at society which is much more beneficial to your health. So the idea is that we can get, and the idea of the Alliance was to bring together as many groups as possible with as many diverse views as possible. Civic trust, local authority, all those sorts of groups saying, what do we all want to do to, how do we get together and ensure that we have a city that's based around people walking and cycling to get about. Now, that's the point of the Alliance, and I think it's working because people can bring their own agendas to bear on that. So people who really are passionate about air quality can come and talk about that and get action happening on that. People who are passionate about getting climate emergency on the agenda, they can do. So we're bringing together an alliance of people, and that's working in a manner which public health always has worked in, because public health always looks at working through organised efforts of society, bringing all groups in society together, working on a particular problem. And I think that's what we're going to have to continue to do. The council is now becoming, it is stepping up to the plate. I realise that things are difficult for them and funding is difficult, but we really have to push this idea that to get anywhere on these agendas, you have to involve your communities, whatever you're talking about. You have to get them involved. You have to get them involved from the beginning. They have to be involved in co-designing the schemes you're putting in. There's no point in sitting away in a back room and coming forward with a great transport strategy and saying, how do you like this? Well, actually, we probably don't like it. So you've got to engage your communities. And the way you can do that now is there are lots of things. For example, Zoom is a wonderful thing for people who have less access to internet. It is of course more difficult, but we have set up a whole raft of local committees, neighbourhood groups in relation to dealing with COVID-19 and the lockdown, and there must be a way of tapping into those existing community groups and saying, what do you want to see in your neighbourhood? What active travel infrastructure do you want to see? Do you want to see on-street parking removed? So it's a question of saying, what have we got now that we didn't have before? What can we tap into now so that local authority really can understand what communities want, and together we can help implement and embed these changes, I think. That's a quick run through, Martin.
No, thanks, Ruth. That's really helpful. Ruth, Paul and I were in a very useful meeting earlier on today, weren't we, that Paul convened, bringing together various parties from across the city to look at the issue of active travel. And one, I think, positive coming out of this is that we will be seeing very quickly some substantial changes to the way in which our road network, for example, is used and managed, and the priorities given to pedestrians, cyclists and motorists changing. So I think we're going to see some fairly rapid changes, temporary measures, trial measures initially, but 100 kilometres of new cycleways, for example, in the next few months, which I think is a real positive, and that's something that clearly wouldn't have happened in the ordinary way. Paul, I mean, were you positive about the chat we had this morning and on that issue, how things will move forward?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about the need for a new story, like a new transport story for the city, because that's what's going to get people involved. At 2030, there's something means something different to get around. It's not just about you can't use a car, but it's about an enticing vision that, what is Leeds for? I keep coming back to this thing, what is Leeds for? It's where you can be healthy and safe. I think that's the key thing, and getting around healthy and safely, really making walking and cycling the obvious mode of choice for that reason.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and I just wanted to finish off with 2 or 3 sort of topics, and we can get some fairly quick feedback on from people. The first one, which has already been mentioned, is the council's inclusive growth agenda. So this was a strategy that has been developed over the last, I guess, 2 years, 18 months. And the idea that it isn't purely about growth, but it brings in other aspects as well, environmental aspects, cultural aspects, social aspects, etc. And I mean, I sort of call it something like, it's almost economic growth with a heart is kind of the way I would characterize it. But I guess the question is it even possible to have should we be looking for economic growth? Should we be looking for a recovery of the sort that we would normally look for after a recession in this new world? I don't know if Robbie and Shannon have got any thoughts on sort of where we go with economic growth, where we go with recovery in the city, given that things have changed so much.
Do you want to go?
Robbie?
Is that all right? Go on, there you go.
Well, I just refer back to what I said before, that, I mean, some sectors need to shrink and some need to grow. So obviously, like the polluting sectors, they need to shrink, and then like green technology, all that sort of stuff needs to grow. But yeah, it's not, we just need to shift away. Economic growth isn't the priority, it's the with a heart bit, which is the priority. So, and really putting health and well-being first and measuring what matters. And in everything that we do, when you put that as the priority, then it unlocks so much like really good action on climate change racial justice, all these different issues. But I think a key point here is to measure what matters. You need to listen to people about what matters. And I think we really need to like start having these conversations with people, like what matters to you. So obviously there's like the fundamental physical needs, like and food, shelter, all that sort of stuff. But then what's the extra bits about what else contributes to people living like happy and fulfilled lives, and contributes to their well-being. So I was just thinking about this like yesterday, and obviously like I'm very lucky I've got all my sort of needs met. But during COVID, it's really like brought home like just being able to like go and have spaces to meet friends and stuff like that. It's really important, because obviously that's been kind of taken away during COVID. It's going back a bit now, and it's been like, wow, that's really important to my well-being. And so then you can sort of think, when you sort of have those conversations with people, you can think, well, how does that fit into these other agendas? So obviously having spaces to meet friends, for me, my personal example, that ties into creating green spaces for biodiversity, for climate, for air pollution, all that sort of stuff. So I think that's a really good starting point, is asking people across the city, like, what matters to you? And then starting a conversation about how that can fit into all these other agendas. And I think you really start to like unlock action when you do that.
Shannon, did you want to come in on that?
I just wanted to just add on what Robbie was saying, in that I think even though we're trying to add like a qualifier onto growth, I think by still having growth in the title, ultimately we're just going back to growth itself, we're reinforcing the problem. And I think if we just ditch that and start with, you know, as Robbie said, well-being in itself is such a complex thing. Like, what does that mean? And that in itself needs to be worked out, and there's multiple kind of things that we need to do with that. So I think by having qualifiers like inclusive growth or green growth or anything like that, ultimately the thing that you are coming back to is growth, and that's the problem. So I think it would be better if we ditched it and had, you know, Scotland and New Zealand they're measuring well-being now, because as Robbie said, measuring what matters. And I think the only thing that I would add on to what Robbie was saying would be, I would like Leeds to be taking a more global and international perspective, because, so for example, in talking about which sectors, you know, we need to develop and which need to shrink, things like the clean energy industry, if we're looking at just developing that here in Leeds, like that has a global impact. And, you know, we need to be mining materials abroad, and what countries does that affect? It's continuing colonial legacies, it's continuing, you know, the global north taken from the majority world. And I think if we have these conversations, you know, just looking at what's local or national, then we are going to be reinforcing the problem that is at the heart of this. So I'd really like to take us to kind of include that global perspective, and I know RJN are doing great things around that. So that would just be the add-on.
Oh, I noticed on Twitter last night or yesterday, you were having a chat with Tom Bridges. So Tom used to be the Chief Economic Officer at Leeds City Council, works for Arabs now. And I think there was a sort of a suggestion that this alternative to a standard economic recovery, doing things differently, that effectively what you're really saying is we're happy with unemployment. I guess you would take a different view.
And I think, you know, we can have our cake and eat it here if we unlock a new agenda for development, not growth, for the region through a Green New Deal. I think, you know, the time has come, you know, unlocking this virtual spiral of growth, equality, and looking after our life support system. And, you know, there's bits of the Green New Deal that could supercharge the city's economy. You know what I mean? And it's like getting that trickle down really working, which is the low hanging fruit. But creating a city college getting apprenticeships that retrofit every house in the city, that's a massive generational task. Creating a Leeds citizens income, a West Yorkshire citizens income, a basic income guarantee for everybody in West Yorkshire, so we can start to make sustainable choices, you know, and then start to look at some of the things that, you know, that Sai and Youth Track are talking about, you know, the institutional working practices of, you know, the NHS, the universities, the council, in terms of, you know, anti-racism, anti-sexist, you know, even anti-classist policies, you know, like our our young people in the city don't go to the universities. That kind of thing is really important. You know, we're not even using the resources we've got. So Green New Deal all the way, you know, and I want to hold some kind of process where we hold, you know, the potential mayor candidates to account that we need a mayor, we need civic leaders now to get on board with this agenda, because if not them, who? You know, we haven't got many generations left, given what we know about the speed of the climate crisis and the social crisis, let's face it.
Thanks, Paul. Interesting. I mean, it's an interesting debate. I guess it's going to be a debate that continues, and one to put to the mayoral candidates, I guess, when we find out who they are next year. Won't be Judith Blake, because I asked her if she was planning to stand and she said no, she won't. But nor Rachel Reeves, because I asked her in the last session. But whoever the candidates are, we can ask those sorts of questions. Sai, could I turn to a slightly different topic, which is, and I guess this is, I would call this sort of signs and symbols. So part of this new world that we're entering is about changing our signs and symbols, and that might be signs to direct people to the nearest walking route from A to B that doesn't involve crossing 12 lanes of traffic, as I was talking about this morning in another session. But also signs and symbols are about the people that we celebrate. And this brings me back to the issue in Bristol. I suspect, I might be wrong, but I suspect Leeds doesn't have a Colston candidate in quite the same terms. But you know, what's your thoughts about how we actually address both symbolism as well as actually changing society in Leeds?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to education, and I know I've benefited from working with people in Leeds, such as Joe Williams, who runs the Leeds Black History Walks, and there's a lot of activism, and there's a radical history walk as well. So you know, it's not exactly, well, Harewood House would be a kind of a parallel to Colston in Leeds, you know, which is built directly from the profits of enslaving Africans, and yeah, I think I suppose I can link this back to the previous question about growth, which I agree with what's been said about we need to kind of move away from looking at growth on a finite planet. We don't have another planet to get resources from, and yeah, we need to look at all the terms we use for things, and so it's now a really good moment to look at our education system, look at how we've been told the story of ourselves, which has been disconnected from the world. So some people may have been shocked to hear and to see the graffiti of Churchill. Obviously, he's someone who a lot of people hold as a hero, and there were things that he did which were obviously to the benefit of the country, but there's also a history of eugenics and you know, racism as well. So it's a really complex picking apart, and I think so some of the symbols that we have dated, and we can use them to educate about where we are and where we want to go in the future.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's again I think sometimes instant responses to something sort of open up the opportunity to have those slightly more considered discussions, and that's where education comes in, I guess. And one of the things that we did last year at the Trust is we had an event as part of Heritage Open Days where we actually put up some of our blue plaques and actually had a debate about whether we should have put them up in the first place. We don't have any, you know, out and out sort of nasty people, I don't think, that we celebrate on our blue plaque scheme, but we certainly have lots of mill owners who benefited from child labour and probably indirectly from slavery. So you know, I think having a debate and a discussion is kind of the next stage on from, you know, that initial sort of response to say this is wrong. You know, actually to start to talk through some of these issues is really important, and that's something that we did last year. I think we'll probably repeat that, and you know, we certainly think about who we celebrate as an organisation when we put up our blue plaques, and we've done. We've started to do slightly different schemes now. We did one for the Windrush generation. We did a rainbow plaque scheme. So there are ways of using symbols to try and educate and inform people. We're now at 12 o'clock, so we shouldn't carry on much longer. Just one thing very quickly, then, just going around. Could I ask each of you to say, one thing that you're hopeful will change, let's say over the next 12 months in Leeds, that will contribute to this agenda? Ruth?
Yes, I want to see a real change in the extent to which the local authority really includes its citizens in its decision making. A step change in that, in co-development and of plans. And
Robbie?
I'd really like to see the council and the different authorities coming out and saying we're abandoning the inclusive growth agenda and we're measuring what matters, and really engaging with the different groups around Leeds, the different activist groups, all that sort of thing, to start those conversations about what matters to people in all the communities in Leeds. I think that'd be really good.
Thanks, Robbie. Shannon?
I guess I'm hopeful that with recent events in America and what it's brought to us here, I'm hopeful that movements like Black Lives Matter and groups like Racial Justice Network are going to get more institutional and organisational support, and white activists learn to take a step back when it's needed.
Thanks. Sai?
Yeah, continuation of discussions like this, but also leading to action. I think that's really critical. That that there's lots of knowledge out there within Leeds, within the wider community, within the international community. So really linking up all the solutions and moving forwards with a global vision.
Thank you. Paul?
I'd like to see civic leaders and vice chancellors and lots of people in power saying, look, we need to start telling the truth more about what we're up against. We've got some things wrong. We don't know all the answers. We need you all to help us figure out the solution, because we're not quite sure what we're doing. And that involves giving structural seats at the table to our young people, because they're the people that are going to bear the brunt of the future, and those historically marginalised from decision making, and putting resources on their laps to do something about it and not just tokenism.
Thanks, Paul. Okay. We're now, it's past 12 o'clock, so we're going to have to finish. Can I just finish by reading this one out? Thank you, this is from Lizzie. Thank you, everyone. I wish you were the ones with all the power. What an amazing city we would have. So there you go. So I think what we've got here is next year's a candidate for mayor and maybe cabinet members, a couple of deputy mayors. I think you're seeing them here on the screen right now. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you everyone for listening in. I think it's been a great discussion. Just to say, next Monday we have another discussion with Mark Finch from Rushbond PLC, talking about development and property in the city and what the prospects are for that. So if you want to join that discussion, then please do so. But really, that's all I want to do today. We need to finish off. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the panel, and see you soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.